luck contribute with another luck. Alright, so just a quick house rules. Okay, first of all, as you guys can see, you guys will be recorded for IAM purposes. Second, okay, so we'll be timing y'all. I the bell will be wrong during the first 6 minutes twice. And also the third, please, you guys have already reached 75, so please keep your eyes. This will take application and also take fun. So without further ado, we're waiting on Lysistrata Prime Minister whenever you're ready. Here.
Making it safe to school that this one inherently has a lot of problems that directly harm women. We tell you on both sides of the house, there are harms such as, for example, patriarchal norms that existed a long time, and these patriarchal norms carry forward as not actively harming women. For this feminist movement, we need to make a radical change. We need to actually opt for a mechanism that is inherently effective so that these females can get the rights that they want and can. Okay. Before that, a few things I will do with this. First of all, I'm going to give the necessary framing for this round. Secondly, I'll be giving up 2 arguments for all these cases for why for this debate. Alright, now first of all, what are free will? First of all, I think few parts of the notion. So what is the rising? I think the rising in this debate necessarily means that we are obviously inherently supporting that this Lysistrata movement is becoming more and more normalized, more and more encouraged in this society, but particularly in US and predominantly in US. Secondly, why necessarily is US the target of this movement? I think it's very simple. I think US especially first of all has predominantly shaped this patriarchal norm, saying how men is necessarily better than women, and these patriarchal norms carry forward in this society, and they are very, very common to America. I think in America we can see that there's most of cases, for example, women's body autonomy getting harmed because of for example sexual abuse or sexual violence. I think these kind of norms are the reasons why it's inherently high in America. Now, third of all, what is the Lysistrata? What does the Lysistrata movement actually look like? I think it's very simple. The Lysistrata movement opts and encourages women to not do any, for example, sexual or romantic activities with men. This looks like bringing away from marriage. It looks like bringing away from giving child, and bringing away from having sexual relationships and romantic relationships with women. Now, I think secondly, why is it in the interest of the feminist movement to do this in the first place? I think it's a couple of things. I think one, I think on both sides of the house, it's symmetrical that the feminist movement wants everyone to have rights. It doesn't matter for what spectrum of the feminist movement that you are. These women inherently want rights. Some of those rights include, for example, they want body autonomy. They want to dissolve this. They want to mitigate and dissolve this patriarchal norm. I think on our side of the house, the mechanism that we're going to be the mechanism that we're going to be right now is going to be inherently better. Now, I think third of all, what is the incentive for when this radical movement is pushed to be for it towards US? I think it's going to be very simple. It's going to be these people, these females, who are going to be empowered. They're going to feel empowered. They're going to feel like they're going to opt more into these norms, more into this narratives. Insofar as this narrative is something that's inherently pushed, people will have more of an incentive to do these narratives, to do what these narratives tell them at the end of the day. Now, before I move on to my arguments, any points? 3, 2, 1. Alright. So first of all, my argument is the necessary mechanization that we provide globally. Why is it necessarily the best method to circumvent this harm from happening besides any alternate mechanisms that OOC will provide? I think first of all, it's an inherently unique mechanism because it targets at the core or at the heart of these issues happening. Sure, on their side of the house, there are alternative mechanisms, for example, lobbying, for example, protest, campaigning. But the problem is that these men are like in constant political inaction, in fact that they do not really care, or they do not see the visceral impacts or harms of this thing. Therefore, by opting for this female, to push by making this female opt into this narrative, they're going to strike at the heart of the issue. They're going to create more awareness and make like these men, these people like in action, like realize more like what the serious issue is. Because I think because I think the biggest issue right now is that there's a lack of clearness, there's a lack of like awareness onto like these things that are happening. It strikes directly at the heart of the issue. But I think secondly, is that it provides a unique solidarity benefit. Why do I say this? Because I think especially in US where patriarchal norms and like predominantly men are better than women stereotypes are at all-time high, I think that is necessarily a better mechanism than anything that they can offer because of its usefulness. Yeah, sure.
What does this have to do with fighting the problem that the Lysistrata movement is assault, that is sexual assault and abortion?
I'm going to explain this in my speech on why it's necessarily important. Alright, so on the topic of solidarity, because predominantly in like countries like US where like patriarchal norms are all-time high, it's critical for us to push for a mechanism that is inherently radical, that is inherently like transformative, but it's not aggressive. I think like for example, trying to be like too aggressive, for example like going into protest, going into like I think this will just lead to like a more like washed, a more dissolved impact that you're trying to get. But on our side of the house, we are able to prove that by opting for this mechanism, it achieves a unique solidarity around the whole entire world for these men to raise more awareness and understand like the issues of the families right now. But number two, why is it necessarily important for us to advocate for solution? I think there's a very clear principle here. I think number one, if there's a bodily authority, because of these norms that exist, I think it's safe to assume that men think that are inherently better than women. Men think that they can do whatever they want to women, and women should just like shut up and just sit in silence. No. I think on a principle level, it's wrong if there's a bodily autonomy when the woman's body is most proximate to them. We believe that's inherently important for them to protect that, to necessarily protect that. We should cannot get on their side of the house because there's like a lack of awareness there's a lack of awareness on their side of the house. I think secondly, is that in terms of accountability, by pushing for the mechanism that we provided, we are assuring you that we're going to get more accountability on our side of the house. What does this look like? I think this looks like men who wanted to like opt into this film with sexual and romantic relationships, which will lead to like a lot of like harmful impacts, will be held more accountable because people have more awareness on our side at the end of the day. But I think in terms of like justice, okay, the main point of the feminist movement is that they want to reclaim ultimate gender rights, gender rights and gender equality for both male and female. On our side of the house, we're able to achieve this justice because this narrative necessarily empowers women to feel like they can retain control of their bodies, and this can also be used as like a tool of like political power. Why? Because on our side of the house, when women are like more opting into not falling for this harm, or like falling for this narrative, we say that this is giving them more political power, more political push, more like political more of a political stance for them to push. Let's not push and not necessarily just targeted towards males in the first place. Now, if you want to work where we necessarily cater to the interests of the feminist movement and cater to this movement in the first place, side with opening government.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Third time speech, calling on legal opposition.
The biggest clarification that I'm going to make in this debate is that the Lysistrata movement is not the feminist movement. That is something crucial that both government teams need to understand. It is another sector, or like fragmented part of the feminist movement, that is more radical, that is more likely to assault gay men or assault people in relationships with men. That is the side that they have, or counterfactual that they have to defend in this debate. Three things in my speech. Firstly, I'll give the framing in this debate. Secondly, I'll tell you why exactly open government's case dies. Lastly, my point on liberty. So, what's the framing of this debate? 3 points here. Firstly, what is this debate what's this debate about and not about? A couple of things here. Things like rights, such as abortion rights, are likely going to be symmetrical because other systems exist that can give you these rights. For example, feminist movements that already exist in the status quo, democratic parties, feminist political parties. These are all things that can achieve the same change that opening government wants to try to prop. Secondly, moreover, this debate is not about feminism itself. It's about the Lysistrata movement. Opening government never tells me why specifically they get why this is the best solution to have a radical political party. So what is this debate actually about? This debate, firstly, note that this motion is about the rise of the Lysistrata movement. Let's say that this exists on both sides of the House, but on government side, it's popular, and on opposite side, it's significantly less popular. Which means that we can assume that on their side, this movement likely gets tons of buy-in on the government side of the House. Second point of framing. What does this movement look like? We tell you that this movement is radical, they're likely to be hardline, which means they're also likely to be violent, and this manifests in the form of, for example, you demonize people who are in relationships with men, and you demonize, and there's significantly violent backlash. For example, you're likely to be assaulted on the street if you are one of the groups that they oppose, and you're likely to be ousted or alienated because of the fact that these movements are radical. They perceive the fact that you must support their movement. Thirdly, who are the kinds of people that the Lysistrata movement is likely to be demonizing? We tell you that there are two stakeholders. Number one, there are people who are in relationships with men. The most vulnerable stakeholder here are likely to be gay people because they're the people who are they're the people who are most affected by this. Which means this movement is anti-gay because they explicitly oppose relationships with men. Secondly, they demonize things like childbirth. Let's say they are pro-abortion. Note that people who are in relationships with men and people who give birth to children exist under both sides of the House because the acts that give these things that allow these things happen in the first place are three things. Number one, they're biological pressure. You have hormones to love people. Secondly, it's social pressure because there are other narratives such as you must marry someone or the USA is a conservative country in general, but also thirdly for sexual reasons, because oftentimes we just want to pleasure ourselves by going in relationships with these men. Note that all of these acts are done irrationally, which means that they can't argue that these stakeholders won't buy into these things on terms of rationality. But before I move into my rebuttals, I'll take those.
Just a point of clarification. Isn't the reflection of the 4B movement a silent rejection to the premise that women should not be objectified to be married to men in the first place?
Yeah, it's silent. The delta here is that the delta between these two movements is that this one is radical. They're likely to do more things that align with this. Right? What does OG? Rebuttal to OG. What do they say? I'd like to know the fact that they never actually told me why exactly the Lysistrata movement is the solution to the current problems in status quo. We tell you that our counterfactual of democratic or feminist parties and feminist movement in general can solve this. But also we tell you that in terms of the principle of autonomy and accountability, they get down to their side of the house. I'll put that because you actually get less autonomy under government. Because the entire point of these movements is to restrict the autonomy of people to enter relationships with men and restrict the movement. And that creates less autonomy under their side of the house. More explanation in my argument. What's my argument about? It's how we get more liberty when we oppose this movement. Why is this so? 3 tiers to this argument. Number one, I'd like to note that this movement opposes freedom. Why is this so? Because sure, they could be pro-choice in terms of abortion, but they're anti-choice in terms about the types of relationships that people can enter. It's literally against their values, which means they're likely to oppose these kinds of things. Second tier to this argument, how does the movement react when they see people who are in relationships with men? They're likely to act violently. Why is this so? It's because these movements are radical. They hold a strong belief and a perception that you must follow these movements, which means that they're likely to, for example, assault or act aggressive towards people who are in relationships with men. Right, so that's the first way they react. The second, and probably most important way they react, is through things like lobbying. They're likely to lobby for things such as making gay marriage or marriage between men illegal. Why is this worse on the government side? Because even if the Lysistrata movement exists on both sides, it's significantly popular on the government side when you support the rise of it. Because under their side, it's easier to lobby for anti-gay legislation. If in fact the movement is more popular, why is lobbying more accepted on our side? Two reasons. Number one, these movements, if they're popular, they likely hold tons of political capital, which means they're likely to have tons of support. Secondly, if this movement is popular, they're likely to be normalized and assimilated into society, which means they're likely to not be seen as radical because they're normalized. What are the harms of this? Twofold. Number one, you affect the most vulnerable stakeholder. Let's say that gay people, they walk out on the street and they don't just experience microaggression, they experience things like being called slurs in public. They experience they experience things like assault, and like literally their entire relationship is like to be made illegal. But this also harms people in general, because it also harms people who want to get in relationships with men. These people are likely to be demonized. Why is this so harmful? It's because these stakeholders are the most vulnerable in status quo. They're the most disenfranchised. They deserve the best, but we don't get that on the government side. But secondly, in terms of the principal harm, because because even if everything else in this debate is washed, we still win on the principle. Because your side restricts the autonomy of the people. It restricts the simple right to people's bodies and what they can do with their life. This is bad because you don't allow people to access their own epistemic preferences and make the best choices for themselves. What does our counterfactual look like? We have other systems such as democratic and feminist movement and feminist political parties, but also feminist movements. I'll preempt the fact that these movements are likely to be opposed or not win in the US for a couple of reasons. Number one, even if these parties don't win, they still hold seats in Congress. They still hold significant power as opposition in legislature, and they also do win a lot of the time. But even if these political parties don't work, we still have the feminist movement, and they can at least get a lot of the delta that opening government wants. The conclusion here is simple: opening government dies, government size as whole dies. Opposed.
Simple debate, what I want to do, responses, extensions, arguments, and if I have time, I want to flash and also tell you as to why we win in this debate. First response, as to how they mentioned the fact that this specific movement isn't related to the feminist movement. We tell you that it's significantly related towards this movement due to the fact that notice in the mention how it's focused on in the US. Why do we tell you that it's in the US? Due to the fact that this whole narrative of dominance in men is too strong in the US. We tell you that in the feminist movement, although you get the fact that there's a lot of feminist movement in this US, we tell you that this is the reason why we want to use this movement in this specific country. It's because the dominance of men has taken away this shadow. It has been shadowing this specific movement. It shows that the feminist movement hasn't been working. And with this specific movement, we tell you that the feminist is able to achieve its goals, which is, for example, autonomy, as we stated earlier. Second, how they stated that we want to trade how we're taking away the people's right to be, how we demonize people who are in relationships. Although we tell you that that's true, we tell you that this is a better trade-off with awareness. We tell you that although we're demonizing these people who are in relationships, we tell you that the better trade-off is because it gives away awareness. Whenever it gives awareness towards other people so that they have the actual bodily autonomy, we tell you that it gives better awareness towards these men against women. It gives you better awareness from these men's perspective towards women about what they can do with their body and what they can do about relationships. We tell you that this is a very worth it trade-off, and then this is what both sides are actually fighting for. We tell you that we win in this specific trade-off. Now, after all that, I want to state my side. First, essentially, as to why people actually follow these narratives. We have to highlight this so that we can actually tell you why this specific movement is to ensure and what is We tell you that why this movement is a guarantee and how it's actually going to work. Why would people actually want to follow these narratives? We tell you that it plants these specific ideologies into the men's mind, into the women's mind, into people who are planning to get into a relationship. We tell you that it gives you awareness. It gives you the main idea as to the harms of, we tell you, inside getting relationships or childhood. We tell you that the harms, for example, as you stated earlier, sexual assault or sexual abuse, or maybe abuse at its most. We tell you that childhood is something that's false. We tell you that this specific awareness will actually cause these people to have planted these narratives and actually benefit them in the future, right, in the long run. So that's all for the session for my first second. Now, I'm going to focus on my argument. My first argument and my only argument is how it actually impacts the benefits of how it actually benefits the feminists. What is the main feminist burden? Why do we actually highlight the feminist, as stated earlier, is because it's not actually achieving what it's supposed to achieve at the first place, as we stated earlier, the rights. Now, first of all, the impacts towards the feminists. What are the feminists actually having burdens in the US in the status quo? We tell you that the burdens, for example, they have forced ideologies, they have forced marriages, where they also have forced, where they're forced to keep the baby even though they don't want to. We tell you that these specific forced ideologies, these specific forced narratives or normalized norms, we tell you that these specific forced things that have been happening towards these feminist victims, we tell you that these are very harmful to it. And then whenever you implement this specific narrative inside the minds of everyone in that specific country, we tell you that you give away the narrative, you give away the awareness that women are able to have their own autonomy towards their own body, towards their own relationships. And that how these normalized ideologies will actually cancel out these parts that you stated earlier. How you're able to cancel out sexual assault or sexual abuse. We tell you that by cancelling these out, we're actually able to benefit the most impactful victims in this specific debate, which is, as we stated earlier, the feminist victims, or even the gay relationship people has been taking opposition. We tell you that it's also harms. For example, how even if you're going to talk about how there's going to be slurs or assumptions, etc., we tell you that by having this specific awareness, you're able to avoid these people from getting these specific slurs. You are able to avoid these people from getting hatred just by joining this relationship. By telling you this specific narrative, by giving you this specific awareness, we tell you that we are able to avoid the people from joining the main thing that's happening. We tell you that on our side, we're not focusing on the victims, we're not focusing on the surface, we're focusing on the root of the specific problem. By focusing on the root, we are able to take down the case, which is, as we stated earlier, for example, sexual assault, or maybe abuse, or maybe the ideology where you're forced to keeping the baby. So what's the main effect? How does it actually relate to in the real world? We're telling that feminism actually gains the easiness, how it actually gains easiness in order to maintain what it's fighting for, as we stated earlier, rights. How we're able to, in the real world, how women are acting. Yeah?
I've already given you the counterfactual. How do you exclusively solve this problem on your side of the house?
Alright, I'll solve that. I'll tell that on my side later. Okay, now onto the real world. As I stated earlier, how does this actually benefit and how does it actually relate to the real world? As you stated earlier, how feminists are not overshadowed by this whole dominance, or how by this whole narrative of the dominance of men. We tell you that this actually gives the whole narrative towards everybody of this one awareness, about this one consideration that everyone have their own choice, but then they have to follow this specific choice in order to prevent the future disbenefits, as we stated earlier. We tell you by having these, we are actually able to take down the root and actually take down the problem that will come by from the root. Now, onto the clashes. First clash that I have on this debate. First of all, which one actually has better autonomy? First of all, what do we have on our side? On the government side, we are fighting for the body autonomy. While on the opposition side, we are fighting for the autonomy to get inside relationships, or get inside love life, or get inside marriages. We tell you that our autonomy is better due to the fact that people are forced to keep babies or forced to give away their body towards other people once they get inside these relationships or get inside these marriages. We tell you that this false ideology is very harmful towards a person. So by having this specific narrative around, we are able to cancel out this specific important bodily autonomy. We tell you that this autonomy is very important. And then even if you just go and talk about relationships, you have to understand, when it comes to relationship, there will still be harm. But on our side, we are able to cancel out these harms that are going to come from their side. Therefore, you can see the fact that we're going to do that. Second of all, is the trade-off. Sure, you can say the fact that we're trading off the people who are going to be the nice. Sure, you're going to say that people are going to be in relationships and going to be happy, but we tell you on our side, we still tell you, we attack opposition by telling you that they're going to have false ideologies. They're going to be cases in the US, for example, the forced marriages or maybe false ideologies where you have to keep the baby after you birth, as I stated earlier. We tell you that by having these, we're going to give up a trade-off. This trade-off is very worth it because both sides have been stated that although you're going to take away the autonomy of the relationship, we tell you still, you are able to give away awareness, which is very important. This awareness can actually this awareness can actually motivate people to actually follow that specific awareness, and that's the rights of your own body towards relationship, towards marriage, or towards childhood. We tell you that by having this specific awareness, people are actually able to fix the roots. People are able to avoid themselves from the biggest problem, as we stated earlier, sexual assault, sexual abuse. If you side on our side, you are able to avoid these specific problems. What side opposition is supposed to do is why this specific relationship autonomy is more important than your own body, than the body that you're giving away once you give birth or once you get into a marriage or relationship. They have to tell you as to why this specific autonomy is more important on their side. They have to also tell you as to why their benefits outweighs ours when we still have the same benefits. And
Thank you, Divya, for the nice speech. Hello,
The road to victory on opening opposition is simple. We're going to prove to you how exactly that opening government has failed to prove an actual process analysis to why exactly their benefits actually manifest. It will prove to you how exactly the rise of the Lysistrata movement is going to equate into more radical politics, more far-right politics that is going to harm the most vulnerable stakeholder at hand. First and foremost, a few responses towards OG. Now, I think the entire premise inside their case is that inherently they want to do things like, for example, take away harmful patriarchal norms which are harming the people in the floor. Like, for example, feminists, and for example, women who are being victims of rape, right? But the thing about their argument is that they never actually give you a process analysis of how this kind of movement creates the actual incentive for parties to create the kind of policies that help these people on the floor. Now, this is because we think the type of people who will be lobbying for these kind of policies are going to be conservative politicians, and within politics, this represents a majority of men in the first place, right? Two, OG doesn't necessarily prove whether the parties don't necessarily have an incentive to create policies that take down issues like rape, because they don't prove like, for example, the discrimination towards people who want to go into gay marriages, or how, for example, people who want to raise families actually guarantees an incentive to create policy which tackles these issues, right? Of rape, for example, right? So we tell you that the lack of process analysis coming from their side of the house makes it kind of hard to credit the arguments given by opening government, and this is why the argument is quite silly. Moving on to my material, which I'm also going to use a few responses as well. Now, first and foremost, allow me to clarify how I'm going to structure this argument, and then I'm going to talk about the harms within an election and the harms of post-elections when this type of movement is going to be supported. Now, first and foremost, let's talk about the metric of whether discrimination and aggravation is more prominent. Now, the premise of this argument is that the types of parties campaigning for this movement are going to use radical rhetoric to accrue critical mass. Now, why is this true? We tell that one, the demographic of voters are most likely going to be conservative religious people who align these kind of policies, right? People who are already against queer relationship or LGBT in the first place, people who are already pro-life in the first place. Because of this, we tell you that the type of rhetoric embedded within these campaigns most likely look like the supercharging of religious rhetorics. Two, we tell you that religious rhetoric is incredibly coercive. This is because they push the notion that you will inherently burn in hell if you do not support our party, that you will inherently burn in hell if you support the queer people, if you support the people who want to raise a family, right? Three, we tell you that the type of people lobbying and campaigning for these kind of for these kind of ideas and parties are going to be the people who have high influence, right? For example, people like the Pope or conservative public figures like Elon Musk who are already conservative and aligned with this kind of policy, right? And already have immense resources. Now, the incentive of these figures is that the government can provide their company or their churches or something that they care about with immense resources and deregulations like tax breaks and so on, which are attractive to these actors. Hence, we tell you why coercive lobbying happens, because the type of people that are going to be lobbying for these kind of parties are already highly regarded within society and have a wide influence over society. Why is this harmful? First and foremost, we tell you that this gives parties the incentive to act more majoritarian because the majority of Americans are already conservative and religious. Hence, minority policies that the right to abortion or being able to express your sexual orientation as a queer person are going to be pushed aside because the votes of minorities matter less in the eyes of the parties that support Lysistrata. Two, we think this radicalizes politics to a far right spectrum because the implication of this is crucial. We tell that it means to get less consideration towards issues that are more progressive, like for example, environmental policies, like for example, healthcare, like Medicaid, and progressive taxes, which are often, more left-leaning. And because of this, you actually push away, for example, the policies which help the people who are most vulnerable, the working class Americans that need it most, right? And we tell you that it's inherently true because when your leaders, for example, Trump, who already pushed away the Paris Agreement and passed the beautiful big bill policy, which actually enriches oligarchs and harms working class people, right? Those kind of parties are going to be given even more support on opening government's paradigm, which is inherently harmful. Now, moving on. Now, and the implication from this is, i.e., you get less consideration for minority policy and progressive policy as a whole because your vote just does not matter anymore. Two, how does this then how does it then inflame discrimination towards minorities, people of color, LGBTQ, and even women, the most vulnerable stakeholder in other words? We think the point in which these radical movements rise in popularity means the harms also radicalized, right? One, we think the propaganda this movement espouses only radicalizes dialogue towards the gay, the minority, and the most vulnerable stakeholder. This creates, for example, a radical toxic rise in discrimination on social media, in daily conversation, and reinforces the confirmation bias of bigots and radicals. We tell you that this happens to the point where there is a rise in popularity supporting these kind of movements, right? We think that extreme organizations akin to the KKK also have more leverage with propagandas and rhetorics, which are now going to be more accepted towards these people because they have been being put under this kind of propaganda, right? And we tell you that the harm from this is that you're going to have more people who are going to be radicalized into doing acts of violence. This is like, for example, gay children, gay adults, and teenagers, or mothers, and etc., being susceptible to more alienization, discrimination, and even physical assault in real life. We think this is morally abhorrent and something that the government should be doing to prevent. Now, where is against a world where there isn't a rise in this radical movement, right? We tell you that in our side of the house, where this information is less likely to occur. We agree that our world is not perfect, but at least we do not have movements that are rising in popularity, that espouse things that are radical, right? We tell you because of this, there's going to be less narratives that creates appeal or buy-in for radical policies, which actually harm the people on the floor. That's how we win on the first issue. Secondly, let's talk about feminism and how we still win over them. We tell you what are the post-election harms. We think that you are most likely to create an even worse world for the vulnerable stakeholder which you are trying to protect. Like, for example, queer people and the feminist movement. Now, we tell you this because the point in which radical parties that support the Lysistrata movement is going to harm other feminist movements that do support having childbirth, that do support minorities who are placed more important because they are the most vulnerable, right? Understand that we think ultimately, by supporting the Lysistrata movement, other feminist movements and queer communities are going to be oppressed more, and they're not going to have the ability to talk about their oppression within the system because inherently, now you are going to be seen as a public enemy within the eyes of the people because the type of propaganda that people see and consume are going to be against these kind of movements. We tell that this ultimately delays the ability of these kind of movements to actually have for example, leverage within politics and actually influence the kind of policies that are going to be made. We tell that this creates less buy-in, for example, minority policies which end up helping the most vulnerable people at the floor, and hence it's going to create a worse off politics. For those two reasons, we've already told you how it harms politics as a whole and how it harms the feminist movements they are trying to protect. For those reasons, to win an opening opposition.
the comparative of this debate ought not to be this. On both sides, we agree that opposition might not be fighting the MAGA administration, we might not be fighting for like conservative policies to be pushed. On both sides, we both require feminism in the picture. The question then becomes, is radicalism the only answer towards this? I will tell you why specifically, right on my family, as to why exactly it is the only way for you to achieve any sort of change. Why can't the feminist movement on their side work? There are 3 reasons. Number 1, there's the enshrinement of MAGA within the criminal justice system, overthrowing any sort of legitimate policy that is being presented onto them. Like Trump elected the head of state, for example, to be part of the Republicans, for example, and all the policies and the majority of the seats being held by Republicans goes to show that any sort of like policy legitimacy cannot really be passed within the states in the first place or within these governments. Secondly, through processes like gerrymandering, for example, the voter bases of these women within the states are incredibly too low or too peripheral for them to make a start. That's why the Democrats did not win like the state race in the first place, because they were unable to garner the amount of masses, garner the amount of votes required for them to overthrow the Republicans. But then the state under MAGA has infinitely more power compared to all other houses. What do we mean by this? If they want to do things like protesting on the street, which they might argue to get things like lobbying, for example, or politicians to care, they really can't, because the MAGA administration sends national guards to shut them down, and these things cannot gain any sort of legitimacy, and it's painted on media as white noise. I'm going to flip the entire stuff starting on their side then, as to why exactly it does not work. But first, let's just follow this first off-screen. Very problematic, very nonsensical. They say you restrict the autonomy of the marriage or any sort of relationship opposition. Firstly, panel, what determines someone within a relationship in the first place? I think if I'm hanging out at my home with my girlfriend, for example, in the United States, I don't think like part of like the personality group is going to come up and conduct violence and rage upon these individuals. No, more likely than not, these individuals can still live up their lives full of autonomies, and our friend can still get a girlfriend on his side. But at most, even if there is violence, it's inevitably going to get shut down. What is the trade-off we're really taking? We can take things like the silent forms of protest, the rejection of marriage by the 4B movement, for example, the rejection of relationships with men, declaring that you do not want anything to do with men because they have objectified us for far too long and receive our bodies are seen to be used as baby carriers, for example. We do not want that, and that's the trade-off we're willing to take. At most, the first opposition's argument can only manifest in some sort of discrimination on social media, for example. But at most, it is just words. Like, sure, you demonize people having relationships with often having a girlfriend, but that doesn't make any sort of comparative difference or non sort of analysis that can manifest on the other side. Second response, how because of the radicalization coming from the feminist movement, you're gonna garner an aggregate of the right-wing movement to go against the feminism and no policies of minorities are actually being passed. Let's completely flip that panel. We tell you that number 1, this is inclusive in nature. I think all types of women, whether they're black, whether they're white, or intersectional in nature, can still reject the premise of not wanting childbirth, not wanting men, or rejecting relationships with men. Because we think that this movement is inclusive in nature. But also, most importantly, I think it builds legitimacy. This flips their point. On their side, the comparative that they have to develop is a feminist movement that's extremely loud in making white noise, for example. Even if they're rallying, protesting on the street, protesting and shouting on the street saying that we want women's rights, but they're not getting any because they're shut down by national guards. On our side, we can do things like silent protesting. We can do things like the rejection of the premise of relationships with men, the rejection of childbirth. We can garner momentum on talk shows and social media, so we can remove the inhibition of how peripheral the women's movement is, and we can get more buy-in. I want to tell you why specifically we get that in my arguments later on. Number 1, no thank you. Let's talk about my first most important argument. The nuance here is simple. They have been going on the principle, that's why is it important to protect women. We'll tell you why exactly you're able to unlock all sorts of discursive changes you never able to do it, like manifest on OG, but actually tell you why the radicalization is the only legitimate path to garner any sort of change. And even if we don't get change, the solidarity you're able to get for this movement, the communities that you're able to manifest, is irrespective of any sort of probability, and it's very, very important to avoid getting shut down. Let's get into the bulk of that. Firstly, the feminist movement is very peripheral in nature. What they're not peripheral on is women's issues, right? But the only way for them to do this on their side of the comparative is to do things like shouting on the streets, for example, where they're warning you're not going to get shut down. Or other any forms they're going to be seen as white noise. Media outlets are going to paint them as white feminists trying to get rights, people shouting on the streets, and then they don't get any legitimacy coming from the perceived perception on people outside. What is the comparative on outside? on the comparative on our side, because this is like much more legitimized as the rejection of the premise, like sure, your actions are radicalized, but radicalized to the point of which you reject any sort of like relationship with men, you're more likely going to be invited to things like talk shows, for example, radio shows hosts, and they're more likely going to be happy to talk about these things on the left hand side of media, for example. You're more likely able to garner your voice to a like bigger range of audiences, for example, and you're more likely to affect people on the ground because people cannot understand where you're coming from and why exactly that silent rejection of men is readable. This is the comparative here. On our side, when there is a mass epidemic of people rejecting men at the premise of childbirth, for example, people are going to ask why. These talk shows and these media channels are going to propagate that voice, are going to justify that voice, and not going to be labeled as some sort of just white noise towards this feminist, for example, but rather be seen as a way that women are sick of being objectified for far too long, are sick of being stuck under the system of oppression. No, thank you, I have a lot to say. But what does it mean? Becoming more radical does not mean you protest with what doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be doing conductive violence on the street. There's all the other alternatives that we mentioned. Why then is state more likely to have the incentive to care? Let's clarify. The United States birth rate is increasingly more low. The epidemic of this, when you get some sort of propagation coming from these talk shows, coming from media shows, signaling that women are in fact objectified, and the reason as to why there's an epidemic like rejection of the premise of men is because of those things. States more likely will take that into consideration because it implies towards the larger majority of women and are actually directly impacting the heart of the nation. But most importantly, I would like to clarify is that men are most likely to opt into this as well, because men and relationships, something very quintessential towards each other, so they're more likely to still opt into these movements, much more likely compared to their side. So we're able to actually gather buy-in not only from the women but also from the men, and we're actually able to get the sophistication that we require to actually legitimize the feminist movement. Because we tell you, the feminist movement is intersectional in nature. This is one of those sections, a section that fights for women. That is CG. Got to propose.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good afternoon. I wait on to honorable judges, principal timekeeper, and all the members of the floor. So, as the member of opposition, I'll be starting with my rebuttal streams, including points coming from the government side. First and foremost, the opening of government is going on and on talking about how, with the mechanization of this Lysistrata movement, it can target the core reason of what's happening. But, ladies and gentlemen, they have never actually told us what exactly is the core problem of sexual assault and abortion, in which these two are the problems that is trying to be solved on both sides. Next and foremost, they keep talking about how we want to achieve gender equality and all, and how they talk about how they don't want men to be better than women and all. But we need to understand that the relevancy of these points in the debate, in which is trying to solve the problems of abortion and sexual assault, is not relevant to the debate. Now, aside from that, they also talk about how with the Lysistrata movement, sexual assault, we can gain awareness about sexual assault. But this is the problem with the government side. They never actually told us how underpopulation problem. And this is a point that I'll be talking about more in my argumentation. Next, they also talk about how the Lysistrata movement is going to be effective. But you also must understand that the detrimental impacts that this Lysistrata movement will be more harmful to the feminist movement and feminists in of itself. And even though they talk about effectiveness, this Lysistrata movement can overshadow other feminist movements, other movements that are actually trying to advocate for change about sexual assault and abortion. But would I continue?
We were the only set that tell you when there is much more legitimacy when it comes to the feminist movement, which you're not seen as white noise, communities are more likely to be formed, therefore you're able to create that solidarity.
This one again? Yeah.
We're the only set that told you that because of legitimacy, you're the only set that are able to create communities with solidarity.
Okay, thank you. Now, they talk about creating communities which will advocate for abortion and sexual assault. But later on, I will tell you how, even though there is an existence of these communities trying to advocate for these changes, but there will also be another community and another greater backlash from society itself in regarding to these Lysistrata movements. And with that, I would like to end the rebuttals. And next, I would like to move on with my argumentation. Okay, so, ladies and gentlemen, we know that the Lysistrata movement is a movement that wants to directly address the problems of sexual assault and abortion rights. Why do you know this? This is because the existence of the Lysistrata movement is after the re-election of Trump. Next, we can see that first, when we reject the relationships with women and with men, and we reject marriage and childbirth, it doesn't have any correlation with sexual assault and abortion. But what does this solve? When you look at the reason why this Lysistrata movement was formed in the first place, we can see it was formed in South Korea. And this is a fact that no other tables have touched in this debate. Now, why does this solve the problems in South Korea? We know that South Korea has a low birth rate. Why? First, because of the fact that they have that women have limited economic, the economic state is not great. Secondly, they're overworked, they have limited time. And these rejecting men, marriage, and childbirth can solve the economic problem because it takes the initiative of the government to solve these problems because of these protests. But even though the government say that, oh, hey, this can actually solve the problem in the United States of America, but this isn't a problem in the United States. Low birth rates isn't a problem. Underpopulation isn't a problem in the US, and the government won't take any initiative to solve this problem or addressing the issue of abortion and sexual assault. Now, what is the impact of it? It's very detrimental, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, it doesn't actually solve the problems in the US. Abortion and sexual assault will still happen because it won't address the goal. Secondly, it can tarnish the reputation of these feminist movements. Feminist movements will be feminist in itself will be seen as radical. They'll be seen as irrational because they're not actually addressing the current issue of the problem in itself. And because of this, people will condemn feminists. They will be seen as crazy and whatnot. And this fact will make it harder for feminists themselves to achieve the desired outcome, in which is first to address the problem of sexual assault, and secondly to address abortion rights. People won't look at them seriously. They will think that feminist movements are irrational, and they will have a weaker political stand. Why? This is because they will have less support from the public. And what the big impact and the big problem from this is first, the problem won't be solved because the incentives are irrelevant to the current problems, and secondly, the support from public will diminish because of the fact feminists will be seen as irrational and radical. To conclude my speech for today, we can see that the closing opposition has given you more insights as to why the Lysistrata movement in itself will not work and is impractical to be moved in the United States. States of America. And aside from it not actually solving the problem, it also gives you detrimental impacts to feminists and females themselves. And with that, I end my speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the finance calling on job with this.
Opposition's case is a wash from the start because they play on the assertion that these people then are going to lose their ability to have an option to do what they want in their life. But we say it is wrong for a few reasons. But two things there. Number one, I'm going to respond to the political chunk that comes from opposition. Secondly, weighing the benefits to review why the ballot goes to its closing government. But then a few simple things I'm going to clear easily. Number one, let's take a look at what is almost like for DDC and what is still important. First of all, an article tells you that hey, liberty is going to be taken away from these people, and things like abortion rights can be solved through all these like feminist political parties that currently exist within that school. I think there's two responses to this. Right? Number one, on the whole idea of how these problems can be solved within status quo, we think that this is fairly like unsensical, right? Given the fact that in status quo itself, you can literally see people protesting regarding these abortion rights, regarding sexual assault, regarding these people getting oppressed. I feel like it's unfair and like insufficient for them to say, hey, these parties can cater to the needs of these women, right? But secondly, that I feel like the whole idea of you having less liberty is very, very uncharitable at the end of the day, right? Given the fact that the only assertion they tell you is that hey, people are really like committing, people are really joining this movement even more. That's the only thing they tell you. Blue panel, we were like Aryan clearly said, the only type of like oppression that you might get is maybe some like call-outs on social media, right? But I don't really think me or like Aryan who's like chilling out with her girlfriend decided to be punched in the face just because you have leadership at the end of the day. We don't think the liberty of these people are like taken, right? But before that, yeah.
When you characterize Lysistrata as doing silent protest without any aggressive nature, the distinction between non-radical and radical movements becomes very blurry. Please illustrate the distinction.
Look, I feel like this is opposition's problem, right? They think radicalism looks like you blatantly just going up to a person and like being aggressive, like trying to like punch that person or like whatever, right? We tell you on government, the whole idea of radicalism is when you make it more prominent and when you're able to gain more momentum, that's to say you're able to have more people to like join in within your like movements, right? We think that that's the clear distinction that opposition wants to be answered for you. Right? But secondly, that's on the principle. They talk about how you restrict the ability for someone to have like autonomy, blah, 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 autonomy and such. We tell you that this is clearly wrong for a few reasons. Number one, the fact that on government, the fact that these are not just white versus the fact that it's justified through things like social media, through things like talks, right? We tell you that there is much more incentive for people to buy, for people to say, hey, this is not just a random stupid movement that's just giving white man. There's actual justification to try to do that. But secondly, then why are we essentially able to garner more buy-in and why are we essentially able to cater towards the like stakeholders at the end of the day? Two simple reasons. Number one, the fact that in nature, obviously men want these relationships at the end of the day, right? I feel like that itself already gives you the logical link as to why you're able to get more buy-in. The fact that men also want relationship, that is to say they will also voice out for this women, right? But secondly, then on the idea of like political women, Trump literally clarified that America has like deceasing birth rate. That's to say, he also gave $1,000 to each family that has a child. That already goes against the assertion of Lucy that says, hey, US has no overpopulation, it has no underpopulation. That's a clear like misunderstanding, and that's like clearly not what SLS. You cannot play that at all, right? Given that, the fact that Trump like acknowledges this, that also goes to show that hey, people know that for governments and political will, that's to say, when they know there's a problem at hand, when they know that there is deceasing birth rates, and when they know there's a lot of people that's advocating for this certain thing without them receiving these white messages, without them just protesting like blatantly in the middle of the street, like screaming, I feel like that's the point we should be able to garner more change, more buy-in at the end of the day. But secondly, let's take a look at the CO and why they're so problematic. Two points, right? Number one, they talked about how it's harmful because it overshadows other parts of feminist movements or the movement in general. Right? We think there's two things with this. Number one, we don't think that's necessarily that bad, given the fact that A, you're still able to cater towards the towards the wants or like the needs of these people, which is you want to like get out of this oppression, you want to break down these patriarchal structures that have been like constantly existing for so long. Right? But secondly, that we think that is essentially not that important, right? Given the fact that these current fights of like feminism itself aren't really like that successful in doing what they're doing. For instance, like they're just like protesting and they're obviously like knocked down by like manga because of like Trump's like political power and stuff. We think that it's a fair trade-off to say that yeah, even if overshadowing does happen, we don't think it's that bad, right? But secondly, then this is very unsensible, right? You have to understand this. They talk about how people on government then will look crazy for like pushing away from men, pushing away from all of these success, like intimate relationships and such. We think it's not true for a few reasons. Number one, I feel like it's globally justified. The fact that we're living in the 21st century, the fact that everything is propagated through media, propagated through thoughts, that's to say people then are more likely to know about why people do these things in the first place. Right? So secondly, then we think it's also unsensible. We think that we can flip this more towards that because people, we think the feminist movement are going to be looking more crazy on their side because the fact that people with the feminist movement who are protesting already look like they're only 21 years old. There's no like actual significance that is like propagated to what they're doing and like people are able to understand, right? But secondly, then they don't actually give you a clear like a process analysis as to why or study on their side how they do this better. But yeah.
Why does the most vulnerable stakeholder not have the right to live in a world where they can express their interests without the fear of persecution or discrimination?
Look, I still don't understand. You know what? Okay, fine. Iquan keeps on talking about how these people once have a relationship with their boyfriends or with their husbands are gonna like undergo this idea of having to go through discrimination. Like me and Ada and I has really told you that hey, the only sense of oppression that you could get is maybe you would be called out on social media by like some of these people within this movement. But we think on a more proximate level, this would be as simple. I don't think you'll suddenly get gunned down or like charged by a random group of people within this movement just because you are within this just because you're not like aligning with these movements. We don't think that's the case, right? But then clashes that two simple clashes, right? Two simple clashes. Two simple clashes then on the whole idea of legitimacy, right? We study that on government. We study only on government are you then able to form communities of solidarity. Why? The fact that now these things are much more like credible towards the vast majority of individuals. The fact that people are able to credit and able to value the things that you do. The fact that now that there's like less sense of assault, less sense of violence within the government, right? The fact that you're not undergoing all these like crazy protests, trying to burn buildings or what? Sorry, not buildings. Sorry, that's too bad. You know all those like radical violently physical radical things that don't happen on government. Right? We think that this is what creates that legitimacy, which is able to like get that buy-in from people and which is able to grant that like legitimate change from governments. Right? Because at the end of the day, look, when governments see that the things that they're doing are not essentially harmful physically, that's where the government has more incentive to even help these people in the first place, right? But secondly, then how you essentially get more buy-in for the feminist movement, and it's very simple, right? And we think that in this debate, the question is whether or not you're able to like benefit these majority of individuals. Right? We tell you that we do this for two reasons and two reasons simply. Number one, the fact that on scale you're able to like impact the most majority of women. Because the fact that look, even though the feminist movement is sexual in nature, I think it's fair to say the things that we're advocating for are the most like proximate towards a woman. Right? But secondly, then we tell you that the fact that we're able to nuance ourselves and give the clear analysis that OG was lacking, we think that's also what kept us at the end of the day. Right? And look, if you want a side that actually understands the debate and wants a side that actually caters towards feminists and the dynamics of the politics in the US side with Lysistrata.
Thank you, Gavin, for my speech. I'll play it.
I'll now be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So there are two things I would like to do in my speech today. Number one, I'm going to tell you why Lysistrata won't create the benefits that they are trying to preach. And number two, why it will actually harm feminist movements. That's all from my intro. I'll now be going straight into the rebuttal. So first claim on fight opposition and fight government, which is quite problematic, is that the fact that they want this Lysistrata movement to be to be able to empower women to feel like they have control and can gain control over a patriarchal society, right? So they say that by having people like opt into this Lysistrata movement, it will empower women to solve problems, which is basically the sexual assault and the abortion rights there. But yes, okay, solving problems, these problems are important, sexual assault and abortion. But instead of addressing these problems as an individual problem, so addressing them directly, you're instead putting them under the blanket statement of problems that happen in the society where women have this relationships. Which we think that energy, instead of being put towards this blanket problem, it should be put towards these individual problems, so the problem can be more directly addressed by a society as a whole. Before continuing this.
We told you 3 reasons to why you cannot gain any soil legitimacy: because of gerrymandering, because of zoning laws, and because of the enshrinement of MAGA within the CGS system.
Okay, what I don't understand is why this gerrymandering, this lobbying won't occur on their side, because the fact that this, especially since Lysistrata is such a radical movement and it's such a twist from traditional society, I think it would be more likely that the gerrymandering and the ridicule would happen on their side. I don't believe why they're trying to push this burden on us when we are demanding something that is quite literally quite rational towards both left side and right side, which is just that women do not want to be sexually assaulted and that women want to have autonomy over their bodies. So the fact that radicalism is even more on their side. Okay, so next, now moving on to continuing my point, because note that before they actually address the problem of sexual assault and abortion rights, which is the actual problem in the US, they instead have to go through all these other problems. First, they have to oppose men in relationships, and then oppose patriarchy, and then oppose sexual assault and abortion rights. While instead, on our side, they can just directly address these problems: sexual assault and abortion rights. And the fact is, the Lysistrata movement adopts principles from the 4B movement, which isn't even about solving sexual assault and abortion rights in the first place, which means that action will be taken against children and relationships, which isn't even a problem in the US. We believe that the anger is misdirected and wasted, and it starts movements to solve problems that are actually relevant, especially in the US. But then they try to say, oh, but women will be rallied together because it's radical, and it will create solidarity. So first, since it's so radical and so strangely so far from what traditional society is, we believe that women will be less inclined to join, just because the fact it's less legitimate and national to assume that not being in a relationship will solve sexual assault. That's number one. Number two, even if women are more likely to be rallied together because of this is a apparent problem, you're pushing a problem that isn't even a problem at first glance, and it's not directly solving the problem. So they try to talk about white noise, about how when we repeatedly try to protest against sexual assault, about abortion rights, it will be create white noise. But I believe that by making these women protest against something that isn't a direct pointing out towards a problem, we believe it creates even more white noise and will cause even more ridicule for these feminist movements. Yes.
What unique mechanism does CA provide to circumvent the harms of sexual abuse and sexual violence that are symmetrical opposite of the
The mechanism I'm trying to propose is to focus energy on protests that are protesting against these issues directly, instead of putting towards this problem, instead of putting energy towards this movement, which I've already said is ineffective in addressing the problem in the first place. So now move on to my last part. So they're going to talk about how Lysistrata movement is popular on social media because it's so radical, and they try to argue that even though Lysistrata movement is popular, and even if it doesn't solve the individual problems like sexual assault and abortion rights, it's still at least the reach of the movement is wide and will be conveyed to a larger audience since Lysistrata is so popular. But since I've already said that Lysistrata is effective, and by allowing it to dominate and sensationalize on social media, it will overshadow the effective movements in feminism, which limits awareness spread by these movements. So what they have tried to say about the exclusivity on Lysistrata movement compared to other movements, they're going to say it's popular. I already told you why it's bad. And number two, they're going to say it's radical. So more attention is put towards this problem that is very extreme and be more likely to be sensationalized, right? But maybe yes, this problem, this movement will be talked about on social media, maybe on the left-wing media, but on right-wing media, I believe that this will be utter ridicule and in agreement basically. And since the less feminist side of the America, of the US, is more likely to be the right-wing side, I believe that even after all of these things that we've said, the urgency of the feminism having to reach the right-wing media is a side, something that only we have and only we address. The fact that right-wing media is most likely not going to be accepting these traditional values. And now that since you put this Lysistrata movement under the blanket statement of this being about feminism, you're just making a worse image for feminism, in which that they are going to be seen as less rational and crazy. So now I'm going to go over what we on-site government has said, closing government has said. Number one, we talked about how adopting the Lysistrata movement, which adopts principles from South Korea, is not correlated with sexual and abortion rights, which is the real problem in the US. As they said that even in the first opening government, they said that this is the real problem in the US. So South Korea has a movement to oppose their social and economic issues in society because they're overworked and they don't have the ability to raise children, right? And they do this movement so that the government will do something about them not having enough children because they have an underpopulation, right? But this isn't a problem in the US. Since trying to adopt these principles in order to solve sexual assault and abortion is quite irrational, I say. And even if you try to rationalize it, saying that solving the economic problems and the social problems would be better for women, I believe that we wouldn't solve the problems in the US like it does in South Korea, because in South Korea, the government has the incentive to solve the problem because there is a problem with overpopulation. But US, the government is not incentivized to do anything because there is no problem with underpopulation. So the biggest problem is the image of feminism. We talked about how it will ruin the reputation of feminism in every demographic, be it right wing, be it left wing, and that is why I never empowered to.
Thank you all for the time speech. Thank you everyone for the finals and have lunch. Results will be announced in the